private packet of seeds ever reaches the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. The boxes that do arrive come from Genebanks, sealed into aluminum cases and flown north into the polar dark. This is the Night Almanac, your home in the dark, with nothing to do and nowhere to be. Tonight you drift far out past the room, past the city, to where the world goes quiet, and home by morning. Sleep whenever you like. Private individuals cannot send their own packets directly to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. A garden envelope beside the bed may hold next season's planting, but its path north stops before it begins. The packet stays in the amber reach of the room as you drift toward the doorway. Beyond it, the hall is darker, and the kitchen waits at the quiet end of the house. Linen remains behind, a cupboard waits ahead, with Arctic night much farther on than either wall. The first distance is carried by floorboards and a narrow band of shadow. The kitchen keeps seeds in familiar forms. A folded paper sachet lies beside dry beans, while spice jars hold their small cargo under closed lids. These are household things, close enough to fit in a palm. The outward thread begins among them, with the soft rasp of paper across a wooden shelf and the faint weight of a sealed jar. Coffee, cocoa, coconuts, and mango are examples of crops whose recalcitrant seeds are unsuited to this storage method. Their names belong easily in a kitchen. Here they gather as fruit and husk beneath the low lamp, marking the place where a pantry shelf and the Arctic collection part ways. Nord Jen says recalcitrant seeds would not survive the vault's standard dry, low-temperature conditions. A fresh mango stone rests against cool stainless steel, its smooth surface still carrying the weight of living fruit. The path continues beyond it, towards storage rooms shaped around a different kind of seed. The pantry falls behind as cooler shadow carries the drift beyond the last warm wall. Past the kitchen window, the house becomes one warm square among dark roofs. Streets carry the drift outward, beyond gardens and quiet sheds. The roofs thin into larger buildings with unmarked service doors. A working collection waits somewhere ahead, past the domestic edge of town and deeper into the cooler night. A working Genebank comes before the mountain. The drift reaches a plain service corridor where an unmarked steel door separates the entrance from the stored collection beyond. Air moves softly through a ceiling vent. The household cupboard has given way to a deeper interior, and the floor continues under the door in one narrow seam. A Svalbard deposit must already be duplicated in a suitable Genebank, making the Arctic collection a second security backup. Closed containers fill the shelves beneath cool lamps, and one outbound case waits at the near end of the aisle, its corners catching light from the open packing room. From the stocked aisle, the way turns toward a loading room The shelves remain behind as an outbound trolley crosses the threshold. Its wheels pass over the narrow floor joint and enter a broader patch of cool light. Ahead, one closed case stands apart from the fixed cabinets, ready for the chain of places outside. Under the vault's black box rule, each depositor is the only party permitted to withdraw its seeds and open its boxes. The rule keeps that permission with the depositing institution. As the box changes place, the closed case moves onward beneath the loading bay lights. The lid remains closed as the trolley moves toward the loading side of the building. Corridors widen into a bay, and fixed shelves give way to rollers set into the floor. The case is now part of motion rather than storage. A high door holds a rectangle of dim exterior sky, large enough for the next scale of the route. Seeds normally travel by air freight, although larger shipments can travel by sea. For the usual route, closed cases gather on an air freight pallet beneath the curved ribs of a cargo bay. Flat straps cross their aluminum corners, while the terminal roof opens above the aircraft. Airport space changes the scale around the boxes. A pallet moves past service doors and long concrete bays that carry the sound away. The case that began beside a Gennebank aisle now sits within a field of freight. You drift with it toward the aircraft, farther from the kitchen and nearer the open night. At the terminal's edge, the pallet pauses beneath a raised cargo door. The hold above is larger than any Gennebank corridor, yet the cases occupy only a low rectangle at its threshold. Ground lights recede across the apron as the freight lift aligns with the opening, and the last strip of pavement narrows below. The aircraft closes around the shipment without changing what the boxes contain. Curved walls rise beyond the pallet, and the cargo door frames a pale strip of sky. Soon, the floor begins to hum beneath the cases. The building slides away, leaving the outbound load inside a long graphite chamber. Above the cloud deck, distance comes in broad layers. The wing holds one dark line against the blue-white air, while towns below loosen into sparse points. You travel north with the cases, carried beyond the roads that joined the earlier ground. The bed is far behind now, present only as warmth remembered through cloth. After air shipments reach Oslo Airport, Jetpack handles their onward journey to Longyearbyen. The handoff takes place among steel rollers and closed freight cases beneath the terminal's cool roof. From here, the next name on the route is no longer distant. It belongs to an airport deeper in the polar night. The boxes leave the southern terminal within a train of closed cargo containers. Tall mast lights recede across the apron, each one briefly reflected in damp pavement before the dark runway takes over. Behind the glass, the freight building becomes a low band of light. Ahead, the northern route has only sky around it. In Beside the northbound hold, one unmarked case rests against the restraint netting. The space around it is spare, with metal ribs vanishing toward the tail. Engine sound reaches the cargo only as a continuous pressure in the floor. The shipment keeps the same closed shape, while the world below changes from land to dark water. The sea beneath the flight carries no line that the boxes need to follow. Moonlit cloud bands pass over it and leave broad, dark spaces between. You drift above that distance with the freight, held between the aircraft floor and a sky full of sparse stars. North continues as a direction before it becomes a place. Spitsbergen gathers beneath the flight as pale coastline and dark water. Snow traces the land without revealing the mountain interior still ahead. A few small lights collect where the aircraft is descending, separate from the long darkness around them. Longyearbyen is no longer a name passed from one cargo desk to another. It is ground rising toward the wheels. The descent ends at Longyearbyen Airport. Small runway lights run beside dark snowbanks, and the cargo aircraft turns toward the quiet buildings beyond the pavement. The cases have crossed from household scale into polar distance. Now the route narrows again, from aircraft hold to terminal door. Inside the cargo room, closed cases wait on a low pallet beside stainless steel rollers. The ceiling is lower here, and the wide sky has been exchanged for a machine-sized opening in the wall. Each box approaches that opening along the same short floor, with the polar night held beyond the bay door. Arriving packages undergo airport security scanning before their boxes proceed into the vault. One case enters the scanner tunnel beneath small blue-white status lights. The belt carries it through the enclosed opening and returns it on the far side, still closed and ready for the road. On the far side of the scanner, the boxes gather on a cargo trolley near the open bay. Their metal edges catch the sparse airport light, then lose it as the trolley turns toward the door. Blue polar night lies across Longyearbyen. The next stretch runs into Spitsbergen, with the closed cases poised at its threshold. Beyond the bay, the airport's small white lights begin to recede. The route enters Longyearbyen between dark roofs and banks of wind-smoothed snow. Farther inland, the road narrows through winter-dark ground. The aluminum cargo continues beneath the open blue night, leaving the runway as a thin line along the coast. You are farther out tonight, carried past the last airport light as Spitsbergen opens ahead. Beyond Longyearbyen Airport, the scanned boxes begin their climb into Platåberget. A small prismatic light sits far above the last scattered lamps, fixed against the dark mountainside. The shipment is still only a moving shape below it. You drift with that slow ascent, leaving the airport floor for stone and snow beneath a single pale point ahead. The The road rises across Spitsbergen, with the boxes held inside the vehicle's dark compartment. Longyearbyen slips lower on the slope, its lights spreading beside the water. The illuminated opening does not seem larger yet. It keeps the same small place ahead, while the road bends through the polar night. The town gathers below as a dim shoreline, and the higher mountain takes over. In 1984, the Nordic Gene Bank placed its earlier backup collection in a steel container inside coal mine number 3. That first store used a chamber already cut for mining, with the container forming a compact enclosure within the larger hollow. The climbing route passes the mine's dark recess and keeps going. Farther along Platåberget, another light belongs to a later design. Past that earlier arrangement, the route belongs to open ground. Snow lies thin over bands of dark stone, and the terrain lifts toward the distant facade. The boxes continue upward. Their path is aimed at the newer light, where the mountain's surface begins to gather around one precise point. From lower down, the mountainside had been one broad, dark plain. The ascent breaks it into shelves of rock, shallow hollows, and pale seams of settled snow. Each bend removes a little of the town below. The light ahead gains edges without revealing its construction. A cool shard set against Platåberget. You are farther into the slope now, carried at the measured pace of the boxes. The approach reaches a stretch where the ground itself begins to show narrow cuts. They run across the grade below the illuminated entrance, dark at their centers and lightly rimmed with frost. The shipment moves toward the first one as the road rises. Above it, the portal holds steady, and the open mountainside narrows toward the work built into the slope. Drainage ditches were constructed on the mountainside as another part of the completed upgrade. From the climbing route, they appear as narrow incisions laid across the broader grade. The shipment passes the first cut and continues above it, leaving the dark channel among frost-edged stone. The track bends across exposed ground where snow gathers in shallow pockets. A compact freight vehicle follows the curve, its roof briefly catching the blue-white entrance light. Behind it, the lower road recedes across the stone in a thin, pale line. A shoulder of rock briefly hides the portal. When it returns, the light has widened from a distant shard into a fitted plane. Separate facets now catch different shades of the polar night. The climb carries you across another shelf, where the bare rock draws nearer on one side, and the open mountainside falls away on the other. The boxes remain enclosed as the vehicle leans gently through the turn. Their square forms hold close within the cargo space, separated from the wind and scattered snow outside. You move with that contained weight, while the last broad reach of the slope passes behind. Nearer the entrance, the illumination breaks into pale plains set against the mountain. Some surfaces hold a muted blue. Others return a colder white, changing with the angle of approach. The effect belongs to the doorway now, rather than to the sky around it, and the surrounding rock stays almost entirely dark. Past the final open shelf, the approach straightens toward the doorway. Snow and stone narrow around the advancing shipment. What once seemed like a floating point above Longyearbyen now occupies the rock face, casting a faint sheen across the last stretch of ground before the entrance. The illuminated entrance artwork is Perpetual Repercussion by Norwegian artist Divek San. At close range, its pale facets gather into a fixed plane above the roadway, bright against Platåberget. The shipment passes beneath that light, and the dark opening behind the work receives the boxes. The exposed slope falls away behind, while the covered entrance receives the slow-moving cargo. You move with the boxes through the last wash of exterior light. Snow dust clings to the tread marks at the boundary, then gives way to dry concrete farther in. The luminous face remains at your back for a few moments, reduced to a narrow blue-white band around the vehicle. The present Svalbard Global Seed Vault is carved into solid mountain rock rather than occupying the abandoned mine nearby. Past its purpose-built entrance, the outer structure gives way to close graphite walls. The boxes continue inward, leaving the illuminated facade behind as the passage narrows within the mountain. You drift beside the shipment as the outside light thins across the first interior bend. Rough stone borders the fitted entrance surfaces, while the cargo route continues over a smooth strip of concrete. Each turn removes another sliver of the mountainside until the rear opening is hidden by rock. The vehicle takes the bend at an even pace. Its enclosed load passes from the entrance structure toward the mountain interior. A muted reflection travels over the box corners, then fades as a low graphite ceiling extends above the route. A fitted concrete seam meets fractured stone at the next interior junction. The shipment approaches along the pale floor, passing from the outer recess into a darker length of access passage, where the built structure continues farther beneath Platåberget. Technical installations were moved into a separate service building, taking their heat sources out of the access tunnel. The cargo vehicle continues through the rock-cut route, while the equipment remains elsewhere. A faint mechanical hum stays on the far side of the separation. Past that change, the passage narrows around the load. Concrete edges run close to the vehicle, and rough stone appears at intervals beyond them. You drift at the same unhurried pace, farther from the wind-scoured face of Platåberget. The mountain closes around the route, leaving only the quiet roll of tires. Ahead, the built passage changes texture at a shallow joint. Smooth concrete gives way to a darker port section, its surface carrying faint traces of formwork. The shipment reaches it without pause. The floor remains level as the ceiling presses lower over the enclosed cargo. A recessed threshold crosses beneath the vehicle. Snow carried from outside has thinned to scattered grains, bright against graphite concrete before the wheels move onward. Deeper in, the rock-cut route bends away from the entrance glow. The boxes stay enclosed behind the vehicle's dark rear doors. Along the passage, blue-white light collects on the concrete floor and falls away again at each turn. The next section begins beneath a broad concrete frame. Its surface is darker than the walls behind it, with a narrow joint running down to the floor. The vehicle approaches this change in the structure, carrying the sealed load toward the upgraded tunnel ahead. Construction of the new tunnel foundation borrowed a ground-freezing technique used in subsea tunnel projects. Here, the method became part of forming the base itself. The completed work lies beneath a smooth strip of concrete, crossed by the shipment as it moves inward. Past that buried foundation, the compact carrier rolls onto an even floor, and the passage straightens. You drift at the pace of the cargo now, deeper than the entrance's prismatic light. The walls arrive in pale sections, followed by brief cuts of exposed rock. Each change passes close beside the carrier before narrowing into the next blue-white reach. At a recessed side bay, the corridor briefly widens. The moving cases pass its dark opening and enter the narrower line beyond. The mountain gathers around the route again. Concrete holds the floor, while fractured stone appears along the upper edges, carrying the passage from built surface into deeper rock. The cargo remains behind closed doors. A low blue-white sheen beneath the chassis traces its progress through the turn. A blue-white strip crosses the floor at the next joint, then slips beneath the carrier. Beyond that joint, the access route lengthens into a straighter section. The portal light is now only a direction left behind. Farther ahead, the ceiling draws nearer to the roadway, and another band of cut rock appears beyond the pale concrete walls. The cut rock arrives overhead, lowering the scale of the passage. The carrier moves beneath it at the same measured pace. Concrete remains under the wheels, while the sides turn darker. You drift beside the sealed cargo as the straight approach carries you deeper. The storage area lies more than 100 meters inside Platåberget, beneath rock layers 40 to 60 meters thick. The distant portal has fallen away, and the mountain above is no longer a slope seen from outside. The roadway bends after the measured reach. A compact pool of blue-white light rests around the curve, caught by a smooth wall on one side. The cargo keeps to the center. Your drift follows the turn, leaving the last straight section behind without breaking the inward motion. The roadway holds one pale seam ahead, enough to carry the passage onward. Past the seam, the finished wall recedes, and fractured stone returns beside the route. The carrier passes close to that rough surface before the roadway opens slightly. Its closed load remains level through the change, a compact shape moving between concrete below and mountain rock above. The bend eases into another enclosed reach. You move beside the cargo rather than above it now, held near the level of the wheels. A shallow concrete recess passes at one side, followed by an unbroken wall where the passage narrows again. A darker threshold appears where the narrowed walls meet a deeper interior section. The carrier approaches without changing pace. Its roof briefly catches a narrow blue-white reflection. Then the front edge passes beneath the concrete lintel and enters the next enclosed length of mountain. Past the lintel, the side wall briefly opens onto raw rock. The cargo is already inside the deeper reach, moving where the mountain presses close around the built corridor. You drift alongside it as the last reflection from the threshold thins, and a new blue-white line appears farther along the floor. The roadway curves gently away from the entrance. Its pale surface carries the carrier onward while the ceiling fades into shadow. Around the bend, the route loses the shape of an approach and takes on the enclosed scale of the mountain. The surrounding mountain permafrost is described as stable between approximately 3 degrees C and 4 degrees C. That range belongs to the frozen ground around the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, rather than the colder seed room still ahead. Beside the route, a frost-grained rock face lies in the blue-white spill from a low fixture. The carrier passes that opening and enters a smoother run of concrete. Sound gathers close to the wheels, then falls behind as the floor extends forward. The boxes remain sealed within the cargo body, moving toward an inner doorway barely visible beyond the curve. You float beneath the graphite ceiling, while one blue-white reflection moves quietly ahead. The floor straightens after the bend. A long concrete reach opens beyond the carrier, with faint pools of light along one edge. The enclosed way seems almost level from here. The cargo follows it toward a darker joint in the structure, and you move along the same unhurried line. At the far end, a fitted inner frame resolves out of shadow. The carrier approaches along the pale roadway, its roof passing through one band of cool light. Beyond the frame, another enclosed section lies open, and its concrete floor continues toward a dense graphite door farther inside. The carrier comes level with the threshold, and its front wheels cross a shallow joint in the pale floor. The change passes beneath the cargo as a muted tremor. Behind it, the straight corridor remains open through successive bands of cool light. Ahead, the roadway disappears under the fitted frame. The wheels meet a finer surface beneath the overhang, You drift at the same pace while the mountain closes around the constructed route. Along one side of the opening, the wall turns inward through several joined depths. Each recess catches less of the corridor light until the innermost surface stands almost graphite. The route has changed from a broad concrete reach into a compressed threshold. The carrier's roof passes below it without haste. A narrow strip of floor remains beside the wheels, carrying one blue-white reflection farther in. The former width lingers behind as open concrete. At the inner edge, the wall turns once more, and the next enclosed section begins beyond the dark plane. The carrier remains centered as the side clearance tightens. Its graphite shell briefly reflects the pale wall. Then the reflection slips away into the darker reach. A second band of shadow divides the frame from the rock behind it. The cargo crosses that band slowly, keeping the doorway itself in view only for a moment. The motion stays continuous, measured only by the changing space around the shipment. A final sealing line slides across the cargo shell. For a moment, the cases travel beneath even light, enclosed by concrete on both sides. The mountain is present here through weight rather than view. Rough stone has withdrawn behind the built surfaces. The wheels keep moving, and the pale strip under them continues into the darker interior. Every line now points farther in. The last wall of the outer reach slips behind the carrier's rear edge. You are carried beside the shipment, far from the airport's broad apron and the exposed ascent. Your sense of motion has narrowed to the soft roll of tires over concrete. Cool light crosses the carrier, then leaves its shell dark again. Distance now arrives through successive planes, moving gently past. The carrier's flank yields to a pale wall, then to a shadowed recess, and light returns on the roadway. The route remains unbroken beneath all of them. The broad mountainside has condensed into this single moving line. Above the roof, the ceiling holds a blue-white seam. It runs forward, bends out of sight, and leaves a smaller pool of light beyond. Farther ahead, the built enclosure turns around another inner boundary, keeping the cargo on its slow course through Platåberget. Mechanical refrigeration, not permafrost alone, holds the occupied seed chamber at 18 degrees C. At the boundary, a fine current slips over the pale concrete and beneath the dense inner frame, while the dark rock around the structure remains still and matte. The carrier resumes beneath a low concrete lintel. Its rear wheels pass the joint, leaving the broad access corridor behind. On the inner side, the floor has a duller sheen, and light falls in narrower bands. The enclosure softens the tire noise until movement seems to come from the roadway itself. A pale wall travels beside the cargo for a while, close enough to take a dim reflection from its graphite flank. Then the wall eases away at a shallow bay. The carrier remains centered through the change. At the bay's far side, the floor turns smooth again. A soft reflection advances before the wheels, reaching the next recess before the carrier does. The ceiling follows without interruption, its cool strip passing over the roof and onto the concrete beyond. You stay close to that advancing edge as it crosses the bay. Ahead, a dark opening holds the line forward, deeper into the constructed interior. At the shallow bay, a seam of rough rock appears beside the finished wall. The brief exposure holds a darker texture than the concrete around it. The carrier crosses without turning. A narrow band of illumination moves over the stone and is gone. Beyond the seam, the pale lining returns, drawing the roadway toward an inner plane that still waits ahead. The mountain remains close around the whole route. The steady roll slows near the next boundary. You drift just above the floor line, carried with the cargo, but untouched by its weight. Cool air moves along the concrete and fades at the recessed edge. The carrier's front is already beyond the nearest wall, while its rear remains under the last ceiling light. For a little while, the shipment occupies the full thickness between one enclosed reach and the next. The roof catches a narrow blue-white line. Then the line slides down the rear panel and gathers on the floor behind. The forward half stays in graphite shadow, aligned with the pale roadway continuing inward. No jolt marks the crossing. The geometry changes by degrees, from the broader approach to the protected space beyond the frame. The dark front edge appears almost still against the farther surface. Only the floor passing beneath it reveals how steadily the shipment continues. You move through that change with it. Then the rear edge passes through. The corridor behind reduces to a blue-white slot around the frame. Forward, the roadway enters a deeper band of graphite shadow, and another pale surface begins to resolve at the far side. The carrier keeps to the center of the floor. Its line now points toward the first interior threshold beyond the long mountain approach. A narrow graphite seam marks where that next boundary begins, and the concrete path continues beneath a low wash of cool light. The next threshold arrives without ceremony. Pale concrete closes around the roadway, and the broad mountain approach dwindles to a dim reach behind you. The shipment moves beneath the deeper frame until its metal corners lose the last reflected sheen. Ahead, a cooler opening continues through the rock. You remain beside the boxes as the floor carries them beyond the approach, toward the enclosed rooms inside Platåberget. Here the climb is finished. The sealed cargo boxes rest beside the inner boundary, held in low light before their next quiet crossing. One deposit box rides a low cart across the chamber threshold. Its wheels pass from the tunnel floor onto the smoother surface within. You drift beside it at the same unhurried pace, deeper than the doorway, and beyond the last bend of the access passage. The storage complex of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault contains 3 halls inside the mountain. entrances occupy the deeper end of the built interior, where pale wall surfaces meet the rougher rock around them. The arriving box is small against that span. It continues inward without leaving the cart. Near the junction, the mountain is no longer an outdoor mass above the route. It is the close boundary around fitted walls and heavy openings. A narrow joint holds the meeting of stone and construction, while the cart passes along the floor below. The wheels cross one floor seam, and the box glides farther into the complex. Blue-white ceiling light continues down the interior passage in separated pools. Between them, the cart's shadow stretches and shortens across the graphite floor. You remain with the small rectangle of the box as the surrounding architecture falls behind, one doorway and one wall at a time. The chamber air leaves a dull chill on the cart's metal rim. The box keeps the plain geometry it carried inside, with folded corners and broad faces around a hidden interior. Its cardboard surface carries only the shape of what it protects. The mountain now recedes behind a rectangle moving between fitted walls. The cart reaches a shelved chamber. Upright frames divide the distance into narrow bays beneath the blue-white lamps. You remain beside the lower tiers as the deposit box enters the dense grid. Ahead, one open rectangle of metal lies level with the cart deck. The next storage hall is intended to be fitted out and cooled only when the occupied hall reaches capacity. The box remains among the shelving in use. Past the lit frames, a deeper chamber opening stands behind a broad graphite partition, waiting beyond the present grid. The low deck and the steel shelf meet edge to edge. The deposit box slides across their narrow join until its broad lower face rests within the bay. Uprights rise on either side, turning the cardboard rectangle into one fitted part of the shelving. A pale strip of floor remains between the shelf feet, leading farther into the chamber. You drift beside the lower tiers, while the newly placed box recedes behind the next upright. Closed cartons alternate with shadowed bays, and each passing support briefly divides the deeper rows. The aisle carries on through the blue-white chamber. A shallow steel crossbrace passes behind the boxes near floor level. Its diagonal line joins one upright to the next, then vanishes beneath the packed shelf. Farther down, the same graphite structure repeats against the pale rock enclosure. Near the end of the shelving run, the fitted frames stop short of the rough mountain wall. A slim service gap follows the stone, carrying blue-white light across small ridges in the rock. The drift moves through that narrow margin toward the crossway ahead. The crossway opens onto parallel rows that can be held in one long view. The deposited box has become a small cardboard face within the nearest grid. Across the chamber, blue-white ceiling points continue above further bays, drawing the scale outward from one shelf toward the enclosed hall. The facility's stated design maximum is 2.25 billion individual seeds. That figure is a ceiling, not a tally of the boxes resting here now. Beneath the overhead lamps, the nearest carton is only a pale rectangle within a much larger structure. The drift descends from the broad crossway and enters the nearest aisle. Upper beams pass first, followed by stacked rows of pale cardboard. At floor level, one box rides beside shadows cast by the steel frames. The enclosed hall now reaches you through one narrow lane. One pale carton waits where the long grid narrows to a single shelf opening. One graphite wheel rolls beneath the box and crosses a faint floor joint. The aisle continues past the shelf bay, while the cardboard stays close. You move with that change of scale. The surrounding frames recede until a single container carries the route into its folded walls. At the side of the carton, the hall reduces to planes of fiber and tape. A folded corner meets a straight edge. Chilled air lies against the plane surface, while distant rows dissolve into small rectangular shadows. The root holds close to this outer shell before moving inward among the packets it contains. You remain within the mountain, carried now at the scale of one handled object. Through a narrow gap beside it, the shelf grid falls back into blue-white points, leaving the container close enough to fill the passage ahead. Past the rack upright, the route turns toward the carton's closed top. Two flat flaps meet beneath a pale ceiling strip, marked only by shallow dents in the cardboard. The mountain interior has contracted to this lid. Beneath it, the route continues toward the smaller packet shapes inside. A standard deposit box can measure at most 60 by 40 by 28 centimeters. That limit sets the carton's exact outer envelope within the rack. Its longer face extends beneath the lid, while the shallow side drops toward the shelf. The surrounding architecture stays beyond the cardboard, reduced to cool points through the narrow gaps. The drift follows one sidewall downward. Corrugated fibers show at a folded edge, pressed into a pale, close-grained line. The graphite rack remains beyond the panel as a dark vertical plane. Near the base, the cardboard turns inward around a floor carrying forms smaller than the container surrounding them. A narrow shadow opens under the flaps, and you slip through toward the packet forms waiting below. Inside, the mountain hall falls out of scale. Flat packet forms spread beneath the low cardboard roof, with some edges partly covered by others. Their shallow outlines replace the tall shelf rows. You move across this small relief without leaving the container, passing from broad surfaces to slender spaces held between them. The drift lowers along a folded rim. Here the carton is compressed fiber wrapped around a firm crease. Its lid becomes a pale band overhead, with the rack now hidden beyond it. Below, the inner forms gather more closely, their thin profiles leading away from the container wall. You remain within the same handled object, though the architecture has nearly disappeared. From a low corner, sparse blue-white rack lights hover above the carton wall. Packet edges fill the foreground. At this distance, their surfaces are broad enough to become the ground beneath the drift. Near the center, packet outlines collect in a compact layer. The interval between them narrows until the container wall recedes from the way ahead. Cardboard gives way to pliant surfaces and folded edges. A muted metallic corner catches the chamber light within the cluster, surrounded by packet forms resting close together. A narrow interval opens between two folded packet edges. You pass into it, close enough that the carton rim has vanished behind the silver surfaces. The chamber remains present only as a faint blue-white line reflected along the crease. Where feasible, one deposit box groups packets expected to have the same storage lifespan and replacement schedule. Beneath its low cardboard roof, aligned silver pouches lie in one compact layer, while you drift toward the airtight enclosure of a single sample. The shared container falls behind as the drift descends toward a single layer. A slim gap between pouch margins becomes a passage of its own. At the bottom, a broad metallic surface waits beneath a soft graphite shadow. Only the nearest folded corner now carries the scale of the room. From that corner, the way continues over an unmarked pouch face, where slight pressure has left the material smooth, but not rigid. The center gives almost nothing to the chamber light. Near the far margin, a thin pressed border draws the drift onward toward the pouch's construction. The carton lid passes overhead, reducing the packet interior to a shallow chamber of pale fiber and silver folds. A narrow blue-white line enters at the flap joint. Below it, one unmarked pouch lies flat among the others as the drift continues toward its sealed edge. Past the shelf face, the carton occupies nearly the whole route. Its folded walls gather a dense set of flat pouches into a compact depth. The broad geometry of the halls has narrowed to cardboard and flexible silver. The drift crosses the rim and enters the spaces between the packets. The shelf lines fade, leaving a single packet-sized plane beneath the cooled air. You move with the pouch's flat plane as the carton rim recedes behind it. The shelving rises again around you at this lower height. Length gives way to the short passage from cardboard to silver. The larger grid dims as you continue along the parcel. At the parcel's outer margin, scale contracts again. The box becomes a pale boundary at a distance. A soft metallic edge occupies the next threshold, thin enough to carry shallow pressure marks. You follow it toward the place where the sample's close enclosure meets the harder transport case. A typical seed sample is sealed inside an airtight aluminum bag before entering its transport crate. The sequence places the flexible enclosure nearest the contents and the rigid case beyond it. A compact silver parcel rests within the pale crate, leaving a narrow graphite border around its sides. From the crate's rigid wall, the movement descends toward the bag's own material. Its broad face is only the outermost scale now. Near a pressed edge, the silver surface turns into a narrow cross-section. The passage continues there, through the packet's thickness. The deposit agreement specifies trilaminated aluminum foil packets for the seed samples. At the cut margin, the term resolves into a laminate rather than plain sheet material. The rule reaches past the transport crate and into the enclosure nearest the seeds. A layered section carries the scale inward, away from cartons, and toward the packet's perimeter. The cross-section slips behind you as the movement spreads over the packet's broad face. Earlier walls stood in rock and cardboard. Here, enclosure has narrowed to a flexible plane. It lifts slightly from a graphite support, then lies down under its own weight. Beyond it, the fully populated shelf grid remains as blue-white depth. Several pouches rest in a shallow tray, their silver margins offset by a narrow interval. The root leaves the tray and reaches the perimeter of a solitary pouch. The central field yields softly where it spans the support. Nearer the margin, the material changes character. A narrow pressed band holds firmer, and the turn toward the corner brings the straight borders into a compact meeting. The broad surface behind them slackens into a slight curve. The nearest corner passes beneath you, and the compressed border continues along a new side. Its silver face remains close to the graphite shelf, with the layered margin held just above it. The drift stays at this narrow scale, moving along the edge rather than back toward the cartons. Ahead, the pressed line enters a darker recess beneath the shelf lights. Within the recess, the narrow border passes under a shelf brace and emerges into blue-white light. Fine pressure lines cross the metal at right angles to the edge. They end at a clean cut where the adjoining margin begins. The root pauses close enough for the corner's construction to occupy the whole field. Each foil pouch is to be seamed on all four sides and made without a gusset. 4 compressed borders surround one broad central field. No folded pocket opens along the base. Past the corner, the drift moves inward over the foil face. Shallow bends catch the overhead light and release it again. The far margin remains ahead as a narrow silver line. Beyond it, a low graphite carrier holds several more pouches, each offset enough to expose a different edge. A thin reflection crosses the broad foil face, then slips beneath the next margin. The carrier's lip passes beneath you, bringing the uppermost pouch into a tighter plane. Its corners sit square within the shallow support. Along one side, a pale rectangle rests against the metal, while another lies farther inward. Their surfaces are blank at this distance, separated by a narrow strip of silver. The root narrows toward those two small pieces. One occupies the outer face, held close to the pressed border. The other belongs deeper within the sample enclosure, still partly covered by a lifted fold of foil. Cool light gathers along the paper fibers as the larger shelf grid recedes behind them. FAO guidance calls for an outer and an inner label on each seed packet. One lies against the sealed face, while its companion remains within the enclosure. At this smaller scale, paper and foil occupy nearly the same plane, divided only by a narrow metallic fold. The outer slip passes upward and away as the drift continues beneath it. Its pale fibers give way to smoother foil, where the material bends once and closes over the sample. The larger box is now only a dark margin behind the pouch. Past the pale slip, the root enters a shallow silver interior. The upper layer catches a faint blue-white sheen beneath it. The lower layer stays graphite dark. Between them, small seed forms make slight, separate rises, each casting a minute shadow into the fold. You pass the last paper edge, carried inward by a surface no wider than the pouch. Below the upper foil layer, individual seeds replace the paper as the root's next scale. Their contours interrupt the reflection in tiny places. Some rest apart, while others gather close enough that one curved edge meets another beneath the metallic cover. One seed rises slightly above the rest. A soft crescent of shadow holds its edge, and the surrounding foil settles toward the dark support beneath it. The carrier falls away completely at this distance. Only the silver enclosure remains around its contents. Farther in, a closer cluster occupies the next shallow fold, each small outline distinct against the dull foil. FAO guidance recommends at least 500 viable seeds when a safety duplicate represents an outbreeding or highly diverse accession. Smooth seed coats lie beside papery husks on a graphite surface, each form occupying its own shallow shadow. A thin scatter near the edge gives the group an irregular boundary. The surrounding walls have receded from the scale of rooms to the width of a seed. The graphite surface gives way to a narrow silver opening. The gathered forms pass beneath the foil until their separate outlines disappear. A slight fullness remains where the metal meets the dark support, and the enclosure travels onward as a single compact shape. You drift with that shrinking boundary, leaving the loose field of seed coats for the sealed object waiting beyond it. The sealed pouch reaches an open deposit box. Pale cardboard walls rise around it, and other silver enclosures rest deeper in the interior. Their edges catch alternating bands of blue-white light and shadow. The new arrival lowers into the available space until its broad face lies level with those nearby. The movement covers little ground, but the scale around it has changed. A loose gathering now travels as one contained parcel within the box. You move with the closed parcel deeper into the shelf-shadowed enclosure ahead. A pale lid settles over the box. Its inner layers vanish, though their slight weight remains in the rectangle resting on a low steel platform. The central plane catches a muted wash, while its corners drop into graphite shadow. From here, individual seeds are hidden. The package carries their presence through thickness alone, a modest rise above the platform before the shelving begins. The drift pauses beside it, then moves on with the closed form. At shelf level, the deposit box enters a fully populated steel bay. Its pale face joins a dense grid of closed rectangles, divided by graphite uprights and narrow seams of shadow. Blue-white points diminish between shelving frames farther along the aisle. The box has crossed from the scale of a pouch back into architecture. The closed lid keeps every inner layer beyond view as the larger structure receives the parcel into its depth. The shelf takes the weight, and the movement ends. Behind the pale face, a small foil enclosure rests within the larger design, surrounded first by cardboard and then by the steel hull. You have followed the box as far inward as it can go. The aisle extends into dim blue distance, its uprights thinning toward darkness. The sealed rectangle remains in place, carrying its gathered seeds at the deepest scale of the frozen rooms. Nordgen is adding a physical data backup by printing box-level records on nanofilm and attaching the film to seed boxes. The copy remains beside the stored material as a narrow, dark strip. Its minute marks catch a trace of blue-white light before the root moves beyond the chamber. You drift outward along that thin edge, where the last weight of the box begins to fall away. Rock gives way to marks, and a held container becomes a distant point behind you. Ahead, the record extends into a darker reach. The scale contracts again. The record that traveled with a box now opens into connections too small to carry bulk. Sparse blue-white points gather across the distance, each with darkness around it. The mountain remains behind them, present only as the place where the physical trail began. You move through those intervals without turning back. The route is no longer measured by corridor walls or rows of stored packets. It runs through separated traces, with each pale point leading farther from the solid rock and deeper into the account beyond it. Here, a small mark carries farther than the box that first held it. Farther out, the record takes on the depth of a landscape. Compact clusters stand apart across broad, dark intervals. You pass between them at an unhurried distance, while one narrow path continues toward the next layer of information, and the chamber dwindles behind the connection. At the edge of the sparse field, one recessed marker stands apart. A brushed metal channel reaches it and stops beneath a blue-white glass point. The marker belongs to the record's next layer, fixed at the threshold of a wider constellation extending into the dark. The mandatory metadata begins with the depositor's FAO WIEWS Institute code. That identifier fixes the collection's identity at the first edge of the record, before details about the enclosed sample extend beyond it. From the coded threshold, the linked field opens in several directions without losing its point of departure. Sparse connections pass through dark intervals, carrying the fixed identity toward deeper layers, where other parts of the record will eventually join it. One silver line crosses the black glass and continues into the farther dark. The route narrows through a sequence of nested frames. Each opening holds a different depth, yet the first connection remains behind them, small and exact. You pass through the widest frame as the earlier layers contract into pale points along the channel. You drift beside the structure rather than above it. Suspended blocks pass slowly at shoulder height, their cool edges separated by open space. The next branch waits farther on, where the channel bends beyond the last block. At the bend, the single route divides across several thin layers. A brushed metal rail reaches the stack and slips between two translucent plates. The connection has traveled beyond the box, beyond the mountain chamber, and into a record able to carry more than one kind of detail. The upper plate thins toward a shallow black glass basin. A pale line enters at one rim and continues beneath the surface, heading toward a second layer set farther into the dark. The harvest year is mandatory metadata because it identifies the sample's regeneration cycle. It places the frozen material within the sequence of renewal that produced it. The entry carries institute identity and regeneration cycle as separate pieces, joined to the same packet as it moves outward. Beyond the date, the metadata separates into linked pieces. The small entry travels beside institute identity without merging with it. A graphite spindle carries the sequence through spaced translucent discs, each catching a narrow wash of blue-white light. One silver marker crosses the narrow slot, and the layered path opens beyond it. You drift beside the trace as solid things give way to linked marks. A box can be held, and a film strip can be touched. Farther out, the path crosses sparse points above black glass. Fine metal channels carry it away from the rock and toward another kind of detail. One channel descends from the suspended points into a deep graphite lattice. Its branches disappear between close layers, yet the root keeps widening across the black surface. The last pinlight recedes above it. The narrow trace passes under a sequence of recessed rings and leaves the calendar form behind. It enters a broader lattice as one compact part of a larger entry. You move with it through a quiet span of glass bridges, while the next branch slopes toward a small measuring cradle. At the far end, the bridges meet a blackened steel cradle beneath a ring of blue-white pinlights. A small cluster of pale seed forms rests at its center. The reported number of seeds may come from either a direct count or an estimate based on sample weight. A tally works through the packet, one seed at a time. Weighing reaches the estimate from mass instead. Once the quantity is entered, the two paths meet again, and the compact value travels onward with the box's other linked details. The two roots close behind. You move with the pale result into a channel cut deep through black glass. That narrow passage rises onto a graphite plane where widely spaced points occupy shallow wells. Every small node keeps a separate place, while a fine silver path carries the flow onward. You cross the open span with the physical box now far behind, traveling through an expanse made from links rather than stone. Some connections run straight. Other paths curve around dark circular recesses before meeting the main line again. The drift follows one wider turn, then descends through a translucent layer where the points above soften into a distant pattern. Below that layer, the route passes through a long rack of narrow metal bays. One slot holds the carried entry, while the others extend past it in even intervals. You continue along the structure as each division catches a small glint, then releases it toward the next. At the far end, the separate lines merge beneath a broad, unmarked surface. The metal structure recedes. A wide circular aperture opens beneath a skin of dark glass. Past the aperture, the route straightens onto a long scheduling rail. Blank, translucent tabs sit at measured intervals, each one holding a narrow place along the dark surface. The carried entry glides beneath the first divider and onward toward deeper spaces. Here, the network of points gives way to the broad spacing of a shipment calendar. A depositor must submit its electronic inventory at least 6 weeks before the planned shipment. The digital list leaves first, while the physical boxes remain elsewhere. Its advance is marked by a pale tile crossing a black field, with the shipment reduced to a distant block. Time has begun to separate the data from the seeds. Past the calendar, the inventory moves without the box that gave it weight. It crosses a narrow seam and enters a field of sparse points. Fine channels hold them apart while preserving a route between them. The mountain is now only the origin of information, traveling across a much wider surface. A single pale marker crosses the open span. A wider field waits beyond it. You are carried with the marker as the graph opens around it. The physical packet has receded, but its place continues through connected points and slender silver paths. Some routes remain short, others extend across the surface until their ends are small blue-white pinpricks, widely separated in the graphite distance. The network narrows again before passing through a compact junction. Blank modules sit close together there, holding the practical shape of an arriving consignment without returning to foil or seed. One route enters from the calendar, another leaves across a darker plane where the points are finer and more numerous. That outgoing line carries the drift beyond scheduling. It runs alone across a broad graphite interval, then begins to divide near a layered cluster. The branches do not lead back toward the chamber. They spread outward, where one box-level entry can meet a larger body of information without bringing the physical box along. The first cluster remains small and close-set. Beyond it, a denser constellation rises from the black surface, with pale points arranged at several depths. A single connector reaches from the compact foreground node and enters that wider field where the next record space is already taking shape. The seed portal links its concise logistics records to richer accession-level information in geneses. A shipment entry can remain compact, while the fuller detail stays available through the linked portal. The outward line has reached two scales at once: a small logistics record and the deeper information connected to it. Past the linked portals, the branching field begins to thin. Individual pathways merge into a narrow channel that no longer resembles the box-level copy. The route has left the chamber's materials behind. It now runs through planned intervals, where movement is arranged before anything travels north again. You drift beyond the last branch, while the chamber rests far inside its mountain. Timing now occupies the route as a series of reserved spaces. Each one belongs to movement still ahead, set apart from the dense information field. The spaces gather into a narrow shipment calendar, with broad, dark intervals between their pale markers. The next outward distance will be covered in scheduled arrivals rather than added detail. Nordgen's calendar sits where linked data becomes physical movement again. The route bends towards Svalbard without returning to the chamber, carried now by separate openings in the year. Each opening gathers the material for an arrival into one place on the schedule. Before the next departure, the year is divided by purpose rather than visible weather. A shipment window forms a quiet hinge between records and travel. The linked entries extend behind it. Ahead lies the northward passage that brings new material to the vault. The calendar resolves into distinct journey points maintained by Nord. Gen, a thin route leaves the linked inventory and enters the first opening, then continues across the year toward the others. Svalbard lies at the far end of each line, no longer as rock or chamber, but as the destination of repeated arrivals. Nordgen's staff normally travel to Svalbard 3 times each year for new shipments. Those visits give the annual schedule a physical rhythm. Each one carries a prepared intake beyond the linked inventory and toward the mountain. Between the journey points, the calendar opens into longer fields of unused space. Past the journey markers, the linked record continues into a different measure of time. Shipment markers occupy only a short band on that new register. Past them, the record no longer needs a route across land or air. It extends by duration. The mountain stays fixed while the data moves outward, dividing the dark into intervals larger than an annual calendar can hold. The annual divisions narrow as the drift continues. Calendar leaves that once separated shipment windows gather into a single thin layer. Past it, fixed positions extend across a much wider surface. The movement is no longer northward. It runs outward through elapsed time. At this distance, a date is no longer a note beside a shipment. It becomes a fixed notch from which elapsed years can be measured. You drift beside the register as its close divisions thin away. One exact position marks where the longer record begins. The first samples in the Svalbard Global Seed Vault's century-long real-time longevity experiment were stored on 27 August 2020. That date fixes the beginning inside ordinary elapsed time. From one starting position, the measured span extends across a register broad enough to hold years, still beyond reach. Real time gives the calendar its full length. Nothing on the register rushes ahead. Its nearest divisions remain close together, while those beyond them disappear into the dark surface. The experiment moves at the same pace as the dates that will eventually occupy those positions. The starting line stays narrow, while the unmeasured distance opens beyond it. Past that line, the scale changes again. A shipment date belongs to one arrival. An experimental date covers a span that keeps lengthening after the cases are closed. The drift follows that extension across a field of widely separated markers, each one held apart by the passage between them. You move with the blank intervals now, carried beyond the close grain of annual records. The first position has thinned behind you. Ahead, the divisions stand farther apart, and the dark between them becomes the larger part of the route. A narrow glass index passes beneath the register's edge. It holds no result yet. Its purpose is simply to preserve a place within the longer sequence, ready for a later point to meet the same measured line. The route continues through empty measured space. Fine metal divisions rise and fall along one side, then open onto a broader section of graphite. Near its outer margin, another recess station lies ahead beneath a sparse line of pale pinlights. The final seed samples needed to establish the real-time longevity experiment were deposited in February 2025. The recessed point on the long register is now occupied. One compact group completes the material required for the experiment to enter its full measured span. From here, open distance extends beyond the deposit. Past that station, the scale of the record changes. Shipment dates contract to fine divisions, while the long interval beyond remains open. The route leaves the register's dense marks and enters a field where space carries elapsed time, each step farther from the chamber and closer to pure duration. The measured field stretches onward, its divisions opening across successively wider intervals. Past the filled recess, the register opens into unoccupied intervals. Each division belongs to duration rather than transport. The drift follows those widening spaces until the last shipment lies small behind, and a much slower kind of measurement takes over the route. You pass along the broadest spacing yet, carried between pale markers that stand well apart. At this distance, the experiment is held in sequence rather than motion. One recorded position stands near the beginning, while another belongs farther along the path. Between them lies elapsed time, which cannot be hurried or compressed by a denser inventory. The empty spaces carry most of the length. Near the next threshold, the broad field contracts into a narrow channel leading toward a cool work surface. At the channel's mouth, a closed carrier rests beside the first empty recess, aligned with a row of shallow circular wells. Past the cool work surface, the Century experiments recurring task waits at Kaiman Seed Testing Laboratory. It is scheduled to conduct germination tests every 10 years. Those checks turn the frozen packets into a century-long measuring instrument. From here, time is felt as open distance, with one threshold receding behind you. The route has left the mountain's physical depth and entered duration. Stone could be crossed, shelves could be passed. The present stretch offers long intervals with only elapsed time between the divisions. Nothing needs to fill them. You continue along the span itself, where each section feels almost unoccupied, though its place remains held within the larger measure. The calendar thins until its divisions resemble widely scattered points over a dark plain. None crowds the next. Their separation carries the measure. You pass between them at the slow pace this distance permits, beyond the forms and shipments that once set the route. A faint boundary arrives, then recedes. The smaller markings fall away. Ahead, time is the remaining coordinate, extending past the reach of any single season. You remain present as a small warmth moving through that scale. The body drifts on while dates spread farther apart. You pass one pale division, then an expanse too broad to take in at once. The sequence stays with the experiment. Around you, the black field keeps its depth, and the next marker rests beyond the present pool of light. Near the outermost reach, the path bends gently. Its next section is hidden by distance. The span now consists of long gaps and brief contact with a marked place. Past the last visible division, the century continues as a dark surface with room for later work. You arrive at its edge slowly, where the route becomes too wide to cross in a single thought. The last visible marker stands alone on the dark arc. Behind it, the line continues beyond the pool of light, broad enough to hold the unmeasured years ahead. The laboratory doorway has narrowed to a pale seam. The closed carrier waits beside it. Across the black surface, the next appointed point remains distant, fixed within a span that will take its own full measure of time. The century-long horizon narrows to a single document. A depositor may request its material back at any time by giving written notice. The page turns the route from stored years toward living ground, carrying the collection out of the Arctic and toward the places that asked for it. You drift with that small change of direction toward a closed transport case waiting beside an open doorway. The deposit agreement gives the Norwegian Ministry of Agriculture and Food up to 1 year to return requested material. Beyond the folder, the physical handover waits at the beginning of the route south. ICARDA became the first institution to withdraw a deposited seed collection from Svalbard. The withdrawal changed its setting from sealed storage to open ground. Released boxes began moving toward the fields where their contents could grow. Past the open lids, the route runs south beneath a broad band of pale cloud. Seeds from ICARDA's first Svalbard withdrawal were planted in Lebanon and Morocco during November 2015. The stored collection met dark soil and a gentler sky. Contents once held within sealed packets now occupied the width of cultivated fields. During 2016, returned ICARDA seed was both sown and harvested at the organization's new locations. One growing season completed the change from stored sample to standing crop. Sowing raised the plants, harvest gathered fresh seed from them. The returned seeds helped establish new ICARDA Genobank facilities at Turbal in Lebanon and Rabat in Morocco. The return therefore divided across 2 countries. Material carried out of the Arctic could now remain near the landscapes where a growing season had renewed it. The Lebanese fields recede behind a low doorway. Harvested grain moves from the furrows into a room built to hold a collection, carrying the season beneath the roof. The mountain is far behind now. Field dust rests near the threshold as the route continues into pale corridors and closed storage. Dry stems rest beside the last furrow, and the pale field widens toward evening. Farther west, the second branch reaches Moroccan soil. The drift approaches from open ground, crosses a shaded courtyard, and narrows at another doorway. The field gives its harvest to an indoor collection. From there, the route continues through cabinets made for what the season has produced. You drift between the two places as open fields narrow into rooms. Dark soil remains outside, with another season moving through it. Indoors, the gathered seed enters a longer keeping. The path runs beside dense cabinets, then turns toward smaller packets that can carry the renewed collection onward. One sealed packet holds the distance between harvest and storage. Inside, the gathered seed is ready for another movement. The homeward line bends north from here. The new facilities fall behind as the collection gathers at a loading threshold. Beyond the doorway, blue-white air lies over a quiet road. Aluminum cases stand closed near the route, their plain silver corners turned toward departure. The road narrows beyond the doorway, and the fields recede beneath a pale morning. The closed collection is moving north again, away from Turbal and Rabat. During 2017, more than 20,000 newly produced ICARDA accessions were deposited back in Svalbard. This fresh deposit followed the earlier withdrawal and the growing seasons that came between. Sealed packets entered the mountain as renewed safety duplicates. The mountain recedes beneath the blue-white horizon, while the returning drift turns toward working stocks. South of that distant shelf, active collections occupy another kind of Genebank room. These packets stand near plain trays and preparation benches. A seed envelope can pass from cabinet to table without crossing another long route. The remaining distance is the width of a quiet aisle. A shallow tray carries a few dry grains beside folded envelopes. Beyond it, the working shelves extend toward the places where stored material will next enter ordinary use. Depositors agree to make corresponding material from their own working stocks available for breeding, research, and education. One drawer remains open among the everyday holdings. From that open drawer, you drift into the scale of use. A greenhouse bench carries separate pots beneath pale glass, each with room for one small stem. Stored material has crossed into soil here. The cabinet is behind you, while the planted row leads onward under the roof. The glasshouse thins behind you, and a narrow path carries the drift toward open ground. Low furrows carry the return across the field. Loose earth covers dry grains, and green shoots later occupy the same narrow lines. The route has changed from cabinets to weather, from packets to leaves. A pale track runs between the rows and draws you onward. Past the planted rows, a teaching table holds a magnifying lens, empty glass dishes, and several unmarked envelopes. The objects can travel from shelf to lesson without ceremony. Under the lens, one seed fills the circle. Its ridged coat carries the subject at a smaller scale. The path leaves the teaching table and enters a preparation room. Stainless steel sieves rest above shallow bins. Farther inside, closed drawers line both walls, carrying the scale upward from one sample to a collection. The drawers continue until individual packets recede into the depth of the room. Their closed fronts form a dense physical record. From here, the return turns from one sample toward the present holdings as a whole. A long graphite cabinet stands ahead, filled from its lowest bay to the top shelf. On 23 July 2026, the live seed portal displayed 1,401,285 stored seed samples. The long cabinet stands within a count reaching far past this room, held for an instant as one present measure. The number loosens into separate forms again. A wheat head rests beside a split bean pod on a dark wooden table, and the homeward path enters the ordinary scale of food. The holdings encompass crop varieties, farmers' land races, breeding material, and wild relatives that can contribute genes to future crops. Their differences fit on one cool stone surface, a dark bean among pale kernels and finer grass seed. The kitchen receives them without ceremony. Grain rests beneath a folded cloth, and garden vegetables fill a shallow bowl. They belong to the familiar world of meals again, where seed becomes food and the long return crosses the quiet house. At the bedside, the blanket holds one warm fold beside the darkened window. Wheat and beans are near once more, ordinary and close. The distant rooms fall away behind the glass. You are home, and nothing more is needed from you tonight.